The first thing Ethan felt was a sharp pain in his head. His eyes slowly opened, the harsh sunlight blinding his vision. The hot, humid air was stifling, and the rough sand beneath his body only added to his discomfort. He blinked several times, trying to gather his thoughts. His last memory was vague, a sound, a plane ride, then nothing. Around him, other bodies were scattered, also waking up, disoriented and confused. A blonde woman, who appeared to be in her 30s, was dragging herself into a sitting position near a tree, rubbing her temples. A bearded man knelt a few meters away, holding his head in his hands. They all seemed as lost as Ethan. What happened? Ethan mumbled, struggling to stand. His legs trembled under the weight of his own body. "Where are we?" the blonde woman asked, her voice shaky. She stood up with difficulty, leaning against a nearby rock. The bearded man, now on his feet, glanced around, frowning. "This looks like an island. But how did we get here? Does anyone remember?" His name was Connor, as they would learn later. No one had a clear answer. There were 7 of them in total. Besides Ethan, the blonde woman named Sarah, and Connor, there was Rachel, a nervous-looking woman with curly hair, Nathan, a younger man with a calculating expression, Olivia, who remained calm despite her quickened breathing, and James, an older man who seemed to be quietly assessing the situation, absorbing everything in silence. The silence between them was broken by Daniel, a tall, muscular man who appeared to be the most experienced in the group. "We need to get organized," he said, taking control with ease. "We have to figure out where we are and what's going on." Everyone nodded in agreement, more out of a lack of options than conviction. Under Daniel's leadership, the group rose to their feet and began to explore the surrounding area. The beach where they had woken up was bordered by a thick tropical forest that stretched in every direction. There was a complete sense of isolation. No sign of civilization, just the distant sound of birds and the rustling of leaves in the wind. "We have no food, water, or even a clue of where we are," Sarah remarked, eyeing the trees with suspicion. "First, we need to find shelter," Daniel said, his tone firm and determined. "And water. We'll figure out the rest later." As they ventured into the forest, the first signs that something was seriously wrong began to emerge. Primitive structures, partially covered by vegetation, appeared here and there, an abandoned fire pit, the skeleton of a collapsed hut. Whoever had been there before had left long ago. "Someone's been here," Olivia said, breaking the silence. "But it doesn't look recent." As they walked, something caught Rachel's attention. She knelt beside a rock, her eyes fixed on something carved into its surface. Everyone gathered around, forming a circle around what appeared to be a message. Carved with precision, the words were clear, "Only one can leave. Time is against you." The group fell silent. The impact of those words was immediate. They exchanged looks, each trying to process what they meant. The tension in the air grew thick. James, the oldest of the group, who had remained quiet until then, stepped forward. "Is this some kind of joke? A warning?" He looked around, as if expecting someone to step out of the forest laughing. "This doesn't feel like a joke," Ethan said, his throat tight. The words echoed in his mind. "Only one can leave." What did that mean? Before they could discuss it further, a faint, indistinct sound came from the forest. Something or someone was moving in the shadows, out of sight. Everyone tensed, their eyes darting in every direction. "Did you hear that?" Nathan asked, his voice low and tense. "Let's keep moving," Daniel suggested, trying to remain calm, though his eyes betrayed his worry. "We need to find a safe place before nightfall." As they continued, the forest seemed to grow denser and more oppressive. The sun dipped behind the tree canopy, casting long, distorted shadows. Every sound, every rustling leaf, seemed amplified, as if they were being watched. But by whom? Or what? Eventually, they reached a small clearing where they decided to rest. The tension within the group was palpable. Questions about the meaning of the carved message and what awaited them on the island began to bubble to the surface. This could be some kind of experiment, Olivia suggested, hugging her knees as she sat on a rock. Like a psychological test. Like something out of a movie. I don't know, Ethan replied thoughtfully. But whatever it is, we need to figure out what's happening before it's too late. The group nodded, but doubts lingered. What did only one can leave mean? Were they in some sort of deadly competition, or was it just an empty threat? And what did time is against you signify? The sun continued to set, and night was closing in fast. Their first night on the island seemed poised to bring more questions than answers. The sky darkened quickly, and the warm breeze from the beach shifted into a light gust, whispering through the leaves of the trees. The tension among the group continued to rise as each person processed the message carved into the stone. Only one can leave. The phrase repeated in their minds like a sinister mantra, casting a shadow over any attempt at making plans. We need to think logically, Daniel started, his voice firm but weary. We don't know what this means, but clearly, we're in danger. Ethan glanced around, taking in the worried faces of his companions. Sarah was restless, rocking slightly back and forth. Rachel was biting her lip, while Nathan stayed silent, observing with sharp, calculating eyes. Olivia seemed deep in thought, though her breathing had steadied. James kept his usual serious expression, trying not to show any fear. I agree with Daniel, Olivia finally said, breaking the silence. We're in a precarious situation, but standing still won't help us. We need a plan. Sarah, who had been quiet up until now, sighed in frustration. A plan? For what? She asked, her voice trembling with fear. We don't even know where we are, who brought us here, or how to leave. That message, it's not just a warning. Something is very wrong here. Whatever it is, we won't figure it out if we stand around arguing all night. Daniel said, his tone firm. We need to explore the island. Find water and shelter. Maybe there are more clues about what's going on. Nathan, who had been quiet, suddenly stood up. Waiting around for answers is a waste of time, he said, his tone sharp. We should split up and cover more ground. If there's something here that can help us, we'll find it faster in two groups. The suggestion brought uneasy glances all around. Splitting up felt dangerous, especially since they already sensed they were being watched and had no real means of protection. I don't know if that's the best idea, Sarah murmured, hugging herself as if protecting against whatever lurked in the shadows. Rachel, who had been biting her lip, looked up at Nathan and nodded. Nathan's right, she said, her voice shaky. We need to move fast. Who knows what else is out there? Daniel hesitated. Splitting up was risky, but moving slowly as a large group left them vulnerable too. He glanced at Ethan, seeking some backup. What if something happens to one of the groups? Ethan asked. We don't know what or who is out there. And that message, it didn't feel like an empty threat. Nathan crossed his arms impatiently. We need to take the risk. Either we stay here as sitting ducks, or we act. After a few more minutes of debate, the group agreed to split. Daniel, Sarah, Ethan, and Olivia would stay close to the initial area, trying to set up a shelter and search for fresh water. Nathan, Rachel, and James would explore further inland, looking for more clues or a way to communicate with the outside world. As the two groups parted ways, the silence in the forest became almost unbearable. The whispers of the wind now carried an edge of foreboding, as if warning them of something lurking just out of sight. "Be careful," Daniel called to Nathan, eyeing him seriously. "We'll meet back here at dawn, no matter what we find." Nathan nodded, though his expression suggested he was more concerned with his own survival than following Daniel's instructions. His group disappeared into the darkness of the forest, while Daniel's group began working on a rudimentary plan for survival. "Did we make the right choice?" Sarah murmured as she piled large leaves to cover the makeshift shelter they were constructing. "I don't know," Ethan replied, sweat running down his temples as he worked beside her. But standing around waiting didn't seem like a better option. Night fell quickly, wrapping the island in a dense darkness. The forest around them came alive with unfamiliar sounds, and the air seemed heavier, charged with an unseen presence. Olivia kept watch, her eyes darting constantly toward the trees. "Something is wrong here," she whispered to Ethan, who nodded in silent agreement. "I don't like the feeling of being watched." "Neither do I," he admitted, unease gnawing at him. As they finished their improvised shelter, Daniel returned holding a sharp rock, having fashioned it into a rudimentary tool for protection. "This should help if anything happens," he said, trying to sound optimistic. "We just need to make it through the night." The hours of the night dragged by slowly, suffocating. Every noise in the forest startled them, each rustling leaf sending a wave of fear through the group. As the night deepened, the anxiety in the air grew almost unbearable. Suddenly, a scream echoed from the distance, from the direction where Nathan's group had gone. Everyone froze instantly. "What was that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel gripped the sharp stone tightly, staring toward the sound. "Stay together," he ordered, but they all knew something had gone terribly wrong. The screams cut through the night like knives. Ethan, Daniel, Sarah, and Olivia froze where they stood, their hearts pounding in their chests. The sound echoed for a few seconds before being swallowed by the oppressive silence of the forest. That came from where Nathan and the others went, didn't it?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he slowly stood up, gripping the sharp stone he had turned into an improvised weapon. "Stay here," he said, his voice tense but controlled. "I'm going to check it out." "You can't go alone," Olivia protested, her eyes wide with worry. "And what do you suggest?" Daniel shot back. "Sit here while they might need help." Olivia hesitated, knowing he was right but feeling the growing dread of something terrible lurking in the darkness. "I'll go with you," Ethan said, standing up. "It's not safe for anyone to go off alone." Daniel gave a quick nod, though his eyes betrayed the concern he was feeling. The two men quickly prepared themselves and headed in the direction of the scream, leaving Sarah and Olivia at the makeshift shelter. The forest's darkness was stifling. Every step they took over the dense undergrowth felt amplified, the sound of breaking branches beneath their feet echoing unnervingly. Ethan could feel the sweat dripping down his face, his body tense, prepared for the worst. "What do you think happened?" Ethan asked, trying to break the silence that only seemed to heighten his anxiety. "I don't know," Daniel replied, not taking his eyes off the path ahead. "But they screamed for a reason." They moved cautiously for several minutes until a figure appeared in the distance, stumbling toward them. Ethan immediately raised his hands, bracing for whatever was coming, but as the figure drew closer, it became clear it was a person. "James!" Daniel exclaimed, rushing toward the older man, who appeared injured. James collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. There was blood on his forehead, and his face was twisted with fear, unlike anything they had seen in him before. "What happened?" Ethan asked, as Daniel helped James to his feet. It's the island, James managed to say, his breathing ragged. There are traps everywhere. Daniel and Ethan exchanged tense glances. Where are the others? Daniel pressed. Nathan? Rachel? James looked around wildly, as if struggling to believe he was still alive. Rachel, she was caught in a trap. I tried to warn them, but Nathan, he ran. I couldn't keep up. Daniel's eyes narrowed. Traps? What kind of traps? James shook his head, still trying to piece his thoughts together. I'm not sure. We were walking, and Rachel stepped on something. There was a click and his voice trembled as he recalled the moment. It exploded. Spikes, sharp, she didn't stand a chance. Ethan's stomach twisted at the thought, but he kept his composure. Daniel, however, went rigid. And Nathan? Is he okay? I don't know. He ran, disappeared into the forest, James continued, still shaken. But I heard more sounds, there are more traps out there. The three men stood in silence for a moment, trying to process the situation. The danger of the island was no longer an abstract threat. It was real, and it was everywhere. We have to get back and tell the others, Ethan finally said, breaking the silence. Daniel nodded but cast one last look toward the darkness surrounding them. Something inside him told him things were about to get much worse. When they returned to the shelter, Olivia and Sarah were waiting anxiously, their faces tense with worry. The sight of James in such a state made them realize immediately that something had gone terribly wrong. What happened? Olivia asked, rushing over to James. Rachel, Ethan began, hesitating. She didn't make it. Olivia gasped, covering her mouth in shock. Sarah looked down, slowly shaking her head as if trying to absorb the news. And Nathan? Sarah asked, her voice weak. He's still out there, Daniel said, sitting down to collect his thoughts. He ran when the traps went off. Sarah looked like she was about to cry but managed to hold herself together, crossing her arms tightly. So what now? What do we do? Daniel ran his hands through his hair in frustration. We need to be even more careful. This island is full of traps, and we're probably not alone here. Not alone? Olivia asked, fear creeping into her voice. Someone or something is watching us. Those traps weren't set randomly. They're part of whatever game this is, Daniel replied, looking up at the sky darkening above them. And if it's a game, there are rules. We just need to figure out what they are. James, still visibly shaken, shook his head. That warning. Only one can leave. I thought it was just a threat, but now I think it's more than that. It's an order. Silence fell over the group again. James's words hung in the air like a curse. Ethan glanced at the others, feeling the fear growing inside him. If there were traps all over the island and someone was watching them, their chances of survival were even slimmer than they thought. We need to get out of here, Sarah said finally, her voice filled with panic. We need to find a way off this island. We don't even know how, Daniel replied through clenched teeth. But one thing's clear, no one is safe here. As the night wore on, the group found themselves trapped between the fear of the unknown and the certainty that worse was yet to come. On this island, every step was a gamble, and every choice could be fatal. Dawn brought a light breeze, but no sense of relief for the group. The soft light filtered through the trees, casting long, distorted shadows on the ground. The small shelter they had hastily constructed during the night now seemed even more fragile in the daylight. The eerie quiet of the forest was unsettling, as if the island itself was holding its breath, watching them. "We need a new plan," Daniel said, his voice firm but weary. He looked around at the group, his gaze passing over each face marked by fear and exhaustion. "We can't just sit around waiting for something to happen. We know there are traps. And we know we can't trust this island." Olivia, sitting cross-legged on the ground, hugged her knees tightly to her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, more than what was obvious. The words carved into the stone, Nathan's disappearance, and Rachel's death were burned into her mind. "What else do we know?" Ethan asked, trying to keep the focus on facts. "What else is this island hiding?" James, still shaken by the previous night's events, sighed deeply. "This island," he began, his voice rough. "We're not here by accident. There's something else going on, something we haven't figured out yet." Everyone turned to him, waiting for him to explain further. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide with anxiety. James ran a hand over his face, as if he was fighting against his own thoughts. "When we were exploring yesterday, we found something," he hesitated, glancing at Daniel, who nodded, urging him to continue. "We found a journal. From someone who had been here before. It talked about a game, traps, and how the participants were chosen." Ethan frowned. "Participants? What do you mean, participants?" James took a deep breath. "Whoever's behind this, they're not just testing us. They're forcing us to compete with each other. The message on the rock. Only one can leave. It's not a metaphor. It's literal." His voice wavered, but he pushed on. "The journal said only one of us will leave this island alive." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Each person in the group processed James's words in their own way. Sarah covered her face with her hands, trying to stifle a sob. Ethan stared at the ground, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. Olivia, however, went rigid, her eyes locked on James. "And you knew this and didn't say anything?" Olivia finally asked, her voice cold. James raised his hands defensively. I wasn't sure. We only found the journal last night, and then everything with Rachel happened. I didn't want to believe it was true." Olivia stood up, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "You didn't want to believe it? This is what we're dealing with, James." She turned to Daniel. "And you? Did you know too?" Daniel shook his head slowly, his eyes tired but sincere. "I found out at the same time as James. But I didn't want to cause a panic before we were sure." "Well, now we're sure," Olivia said, her voice filled with anger. "We're in a death game, and we're not getting all the information." Ethan, who had remained silent, looked around at the group. "And if it's true?" he asked, his voice low but steady. "If we're in some sort of competition, then the rules are clear, we can't trust each other. And someone, somewhere, is watching, waiting to see who survives." The tension between them grew thick. The idea that they were being manipulated, forced into a deadly game, eroded whatever fragile trust had remained. "We have to make a decision," Daniel said, breaking the silence. "Do we stick together, or is it every man for himself?" Sarah looked around, desperate. "We can't split up," she cried. "If we go off alone, we'll die. There are traps everywhere, and Olivia, however, seemed to be considering the option. She turned to Daniel. "And what if you've known this from the start?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. "You've been the leader since we got here. How do we know you're not part of this?" The accusation hung in the air, and everyone fell silent, waiting for Daniel's response. He remained calm, but his jaw tightened. "If I knew, I would have stopped Rachel from dying," he said firmly. "We're all in the same boat here, Olivia. I just want everyone to get out of this alive, if that's even possible." Daniel's words made Olivia hesitate, but she still held on to a flicker of suspicion. James, on the other hand, looked down at the ground, his shoulders heavy with the weight of what he had revealed. "Look, I get what's at stake," Ethan said, stepping forward to try and restore some order. "But fighting among ourselves isn't going to help. We have to figure out what else this island is hiding. There has to be a way out, something we haven't seen yet." Olivia crossed her arms, thinking it over, but eventually nodded. Sarah, still trembling, remained silent. "Then we stick together," Daniel decided. "But cautiously. We have to be ready for anything." Tempers were still running high, but for now, they chose to stay as a group. However, the seed of doubt had already been planted. And as the tension hung in the air, the distrust among them began to grow, slow and insidious. The group moved cautiously through the forest, each step weighed down by the thick mistrust between them. James's revelation still echoed in their minds, the idea that they were in a competition where only one could lose. The fragile trust they had started with was now eroding, leaving suspicion and unease in its place. Daniel led the way, always alert for any sign of traps or danger hidden in the underbrush. Sarah stayed close behind him, her eyes constantly scanning their surroundings as if expecting something to jump out at them. Ethan and Olivia kept a slight distance, while James lagged a bit, his face still showing signs of guilt and fear. "This doesn't make sense," Sarah murmured, her voice low but filled with frustration. "Why would anyone do this? Force us to compete to survive?" "Control," Olivia answered coldly. "It's always about control. Whoever's behind this, they're manipulating us. They want to see how far we'll go to survive." Ethan looked at Olivia, considering her words. It made a twisted kind of sense. He knew that under extreme pressure, people were capable of things they could never imagine. But who would go to such lengths to create a game this cruel? And why? "But what's the point of it?" Sarah asked, still struggling to accept the reality. "It can't just be a social experiment, there has to be more." Daniel stopped suddenly, raising his hand for everyone to stay quiet. The distant sound of rustling leaves caught his attention. Something, or someone, was moving toward them. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. The group exchanged nervous glances, fear spreading quickly. They stood still, listening as the noise grew louder, the movement coming closer. Daniel crouched low, readying the sharp stone in his hand, his body tense, prepared for whatever might come. Ethan felt his pulse quicken, his muscles tightening in response. Out of the darkness of the forest, Nathan suddenly appeared, running toward them, drenched in sweat. His clothes were torn, and his face was scratched, eyes wide with panic. He stumbled as he reached the group, gasping for breath. "Nathan!" Sarah cried, rushing over to him. "What happened? Where have you been?" Nathan was still panting, unable to speak at first. He looked around at all of them, a mixture of relief and terror in his eyes. "Traps," he finally managed to say, his voice trembling. "There are traps everywhere. Rachel, I couldn't save her." Olivia narrowed her eyes, stepping toward Nathan cautiously. "We know that," she said sharply. "What happened after she died? Why did you run?" Nathan shook his head, looking shocked at the accusation. I panicked. The traps were everywhere. I thought I'd be next. I tried to come back, but I got lost. Daniel stepped forward, studying Nathan carefully. The fear in the man's eyes was clear, but there was something else, hesitation, maybe guilt. "And why didn't you come back sooner?" Daniel asked. "We've been looking for you." Nathan lowered his head, avoiding their gaze. I got lost," he repeated, though his voice lacked conviction. The silence that followed was uncomfortable. Sarah looked between them all, sensing the tension. "It doesn't matter what happened," she said quickly, trying to ease the situation. "What matters is that he's here now. We need to stay together." But Olivia wasn't ready to let it go so easily. "He got lost? Or was he hiding?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Maybe Nathan knows more about these traps than he's letting on." Nathan's eyes widened in shock at the accusation, taking a step toward Olivia and pointing a finger at her. "What? You think I did this?" He took another step forward, glaring at her. "I'm just as much a victim as you are. Maybe. Or maybe you knew more about what's happening here all along," Olivia shot back, not backing down. "Ever since that message appeared, things have been going downhill, and you're not being honest with us. Isn't that right, Daniel?" Daniel stayed silent for a moment, his eyes locked on Nathan. He knew conflict wouldn't help, but Olivia had raised a question that was already on everyone's mind: who could they trust? "We're all lost here," Daniel finally said, his tone calmer. "But we need to work together if we want to survive. Distrust is only going to make us weaker." Olivia shook her head, clearly still uncomfortable with the situation, but she didn't push any further. Ethan, who had been watching the argument from a distance, could see that the group's cohesion was starting to crumble. "Look," Ethan said, stepping in to try and restore some order. "Arguing about this now isn't going to get us anywhere. We need to focus on getting off this island. Nathan, if you're with us, great. If not, just don't get in our way." Nathan stared at Ethan for a moment, then nodded, his jaw clenched in frustration. "I'm with you," Nathan said, though there was still a note of resentment in his voice. The group moved on, but the tension between them was impossible to ignore. The collapse of their alliances was beginning. The trust they had once tried to build was now falling apart, and the island, with its unseen traps and lurking threats, seemed to feed off their growing paranoia. As they walked deeper into the forest, Ethan noticed something strange in the distance. A faint metallic glint caught the sunlight between the trees. He stopped and cautiously moved closer. "What's that?" he murmured, pointing toward the object. The group gathered around, discovering what appeared to be a small device. It was a surveillance camera, hidden among the foliage and fixed to the trunk of a tree. A small red light blinked slowly, indicating it was active. "We're being watched," Daniel said, his voice dark. The game was bigger than they had imagined. It wasn't just about surviving the physical dangers of the island, they were being monitored, their every move judged by unseen eyes. And now, more than ever, they knew that every decision could be their last. The group stood frozen, staring at the hidden camera, its small red light blinking ominously. The metallic glint seemed to mock them, a clear reminder that they weren't alone. They were being watched, evaluated. Every move they made, every word they exchanged, was being monitored. "They've been watching us the entire time," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with realization. "Like rats in a maze." Daniel clenched his fists, his face hardening. He had suspected this all along, but seeing it so blatantly confirmed made the danger feel more real. "So that's it," Olivia said, her voice filled with anger. "They want to see us break. They want to see us make impossible choices." Nathan took a step back, as if the camera had personally betrayed him. This is insane, he said, looking around as if expecting to find more hidden devices. Who would do something like this? Someone with enough power to pull off this nightmare, Ethan responded, his tone tense. It's not just about surviving the physical traps. They want to push us to the edge mentally. Daniel stepped closer to the camera, studying it carefully. He had the look of someone trying to solve a puzzle with pieces missing. Maybe this is part of the test, he said, his gaze fixed on the device. They're forcing us into choices we'd never make under normal circumstances. And now they're waiting to see what we do with this information. Olivia crossed her arms, clearly disturbed by the idea. Choices like what? She asked, her voice sharp. Like killing each other? The silence that followed was heavy. The possibility, though unspoken until now, had been there all along, hanging over them like a dark cloud. Only one can leave. If the words on the stone were to be taken literally, then eventually, one of them might have to make an unthinkable decision. No, Ethan said, breaking the silence. We don't have to play their game. We can still work together and find a way out of here, all of us. Olivia scoffed bitterly. And you actually believe that? She asked. You think after everything we've seen, there's still a chance we'll all get out of here alive? They've made it clear, only one of us will leave. Maybe there's a way out that they didn't plan for, Ethan countered, though he knew he was holding on to a fragile hope. Nathan, who had been quiet, stepped forward, his expression serious. And what if there isn't? He asked. What if the only way to survive is to do what they expect? Daniel turned to face Nathan, his eyes locked on him. That's not going to happen, Daniel said firmly. We're not going to turn into killers. But Nathan shook his head, his eyes darkening with dread. Do you think they care what we want? He asked. They've been pushing us toward this since the beginning. And in the end, it's going to be every man for himself. If you don't do what it takes to survive, you'll end up like Rachel. Nathan's words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Rachel's death was still a fresh wound, and the idea of her fate being inevitable added to the suffocating sense of dread. That's exactly what they want us to think, Ethan said, anger rising in his voice. They want us to destroy ourselves, but we don't have to do that. We can win without playing by their rules. Nathan laughed bitterly, his frustration evident. And how, exactly, do you plan to do that? He asked. You think you can avoid every trap and escape unscathed? You think we can all make it out of here? Before Ethan could answer, a low, metallic sound echoed from deeper in the forest. The group immediately tensed, their bodies stiffening with fear. The sound was distant but unmistakable, another trap had been triggered somewhere. What was that? Sarah asked, her voice shaking. Another trap, Olivia said grimly, her voice barely above a whisper. We don't know how many more there are. Daniel looked around, his muscles tense with readiness. We need to get out of here. The longer we stay in one place, the more vulnerable we are. As the group began to reorganize, Nathan stepped forward again, his expression now darker and more determined. Listen, he said, his voice low but firm. Maybe it's time we made a hard choice. If the only way out of here is to follow the rules, then maybe we have to sacrifice someone. The group froze. Nathan's words reverberated in the silence, and every eye turned to him. What he was suggesting wasn't just a morally repulsive option, it was one that could shatter the group completely. You're suggesting we kill someone? Olivia asked, her voice filled with disbelief. Nathan looked down at the ground, taking a deep breath before answering. It's not what I want, he said, his voice quiet. But if it's the only way. Daniel stepped forward, cutting him off. "We're not doing that," Daniel said, his voice steely. "We're not going to become the monsters they want us to be." The tension between them was palpable. Though everyone knew what was at stake, there was still a line no one was willing to cross, at least, not yet. But Nathan's words lingered in the air, a cruel reminder of the dilemma they faced. The game was getting more dangerous. And as the hours passed, their choices were becoming more limited. The tension among the group was thick as they moved deeper into the forest. Nathan's words still echoed in their minds, the suggestion that in order to survive, they might have to sacrifice someone. It was an idea no one wanted to face head-on, but with each step they took, the fear of what lay ahead weighed heavier on them all. The sound of leaves crunching underfoot mixed with the distant noises of birds and animals. But there was something else in the silence, an invisible presence that seemed to follow them, watching their every move. "We need to find the control center," Daniel said, breaking the tense silence. "We know we're being monitored, and if we can figure out where they're controlling this from, maybe we'll have a chance." "And how exactly do you suggest we do that?" Olivia asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "We've got traps everywhere and almost no resources. We're stumbling around blind. Better than sitting still and waiting for something to come after us," Daniel shot back. "We have to stay proactive." Ethan lagged slightly behind the group, lost in thought. Every step felt heavier, as if the island itself was draining his strength. The weight of responsibility and the uncertainty about what to do next gnawed at him. He knew something big was about to happen, but he couldn't see a clear path forward, especially if they wanted to get out alive, together. Suddenly, Sarah, who had been walking ahead, stopped abruptly. "Wait," she called out, raising her hand. "Look over there." In the distance, partially hidden among the trees, was a small stone structure. It looked like part of something much older, an ancient construction long forgotten. The group cautiously approached, and as they got closer, they saw what appeared to be an entrance, a doorway leading into a cave or underground tunnel. "This looks like a shelter," Nathan said, eyeing it cautiously. "Maybe it's more than that," Ethan said, examining the stone. "It could be an entrance to some kind of facility." Daniel moved closer to inspect it, his gaze sharp as he studied the structure. "This might be where they're controlling everything," he said. "If we can get inside, we might find answers. And maybe find a way out," Olivia added, her eyes fixed on the darkness of the tunnel ahead. Without further hesitation, the group decided to enter. The tunnel was narrow and dark, and the air inside was damp and heavy, as though it hadn't been disturbed in years. The cold stone walls reflected the oppressive silence of the place, and every step they took echoed unnervingly in the confined space. After a few minutes of walking, they entered a larger room. It was dimly lit, with a few pieces of equipment scattered on tables. Old computers, wires hanging loose, and broken monitors suggested the place had been abandoned for quite some time, or that something had gone terribly wrong here. "This doesn't feel right," Ethan murmured, looking around uneasily. Sarah approached one of the tables and ran her hand over the dust-covered equipment. "They were watching everything from here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Suddenly, a screen in front of Daniel flickered to life, and the group froze. A video began playing. It was black and white footage of a room similar to the one they were standing in. The video showed several people, apparently prisoners like them, being instructed by a mechanical voice about the game they had to play in order to survive. The terror in their eyes was unmistakable, and the video showed horrifying scenes of the traps being triggered. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, horrified. "This happened before. We're not the first." The video continued, showing the participants being forced to make brutal choices in order to survive. At one point, one of the prisoners, visibly disturbed, picked up a gun placed in front of him and shot another participant. The voice on the video said, "Only one can leave." "We're trapped in a cycle," Olivia said, her voice now filled with anger. "They do this over and over, testing people like lab rats." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. If the video was proof of what had happened before, then the same fate awaited them. The dread of the situation grew stronger with every passing second. "This just proves we can't trust this place," Daniel said, turning off the screen. "We need to find a way out of here now." Nathan, who had been silent, took a step back, his eyes darting around the room, now filled with unease. "And what if," he began, hesitating. "What if the only way out is to follow the rules?" Everyone turned to him, confused. "What are you saying?" Ethan asked, his voice low and suspicious. Nathan seemed to wrestle with the fear growing inside him. "I'm saying that maybe the only way out is to do what they want. If only one of us can leave, then maybe," he looked down, unable to finish the thought. "No!" Olivia shouted, cutting him off. "We're not playing their game. We're not becoming murderers." Nathan took a step forward, eyes wide with desperation. "And what if we're already playing, Olivia? What if everything we've done so far is part of it? They want us to resist, to fight against what we know is inevitable, but in the end, maybe there's only one way out." Silence fell over the group. The idea that they might have to sacrifice one of their own to survive was unbearable, but standing there, in that oppressive space, the pressure was immense. Daniel, who had kept his composure until now, looked visibly disturbed. "We can't let ourselves go down that path," Daniel said, shaking his head. "There has to be another way. There's always another way." But the atmosphere in the room was heavy, and the tension between them had reached a breaking point. Everyone knew time was running out, and their options were shrinking fast. Suddenly, a siren blared, echoing through the tunnel. The remaining lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the stone walls. Something had been triggered. "We have to get out of here," Ethan shouted, adrenaline kicking in. The group sprinted back through the tunnel, the sound of the siren growing louder behind them. But now, beyond the physical danger, the greatest threat was the moral dilemma looming over them. The inevitable sacrifice. And deep down, they all knew that a terrible decision was about to be made. The sound of the siren echoed through the stone corridors, growing louder and more oppressive with each passing second. The group ran in desperation, their hearts pounding and their breathing labored, as the flickering lights in the tunnel cast eerie, shifting shadows on the walls. The tunnel seemed endless, like a labyrinth with no exit, but they knew something dangerous was chasing them from behind. Ethan led the way, Daniel close on his heels, while Nathan, Olivia, and Sarah struggled to keep pace. Fear fueled their movements, but the weight of everything they had just discovered, the truth of the game and the choices they might be forced to make, hung over them like a storm cloud. "We need to get out of this tunnel before it's too late," Daniel shouted, not looking back. They finally reached the tunnel's exit, emerging back into the thick forest. The siren's wail was still audible, but it seemed more distant now, as if they had bought themselves a few moments of safety. However, the tension among them remained, and the dilemma they faced could no longer be ignored. Olivia was the first to stop abruptly, turning to face the others. "What now?" she demanded, her voice sharp with anger and frustration. "What do we do now? Keep pretending that all of us are going to make it out of here alive?" Nathan, still catching his breath, wiped the sweat from his face, his clothes torn and his expression grim. "I already told you, maybe the only way out is to do what they want," he hesitated, avoiding their eyes. "That's insane, Nathan," Sarah cried, her eyes brimming with tears. "We can't just kill each other. And you think they're going to let us walk away?" Nathan shot back, his voice rising. You saw what happened to the others. That video made it clear. There's no happy ending to this. The group fell silent, the fear and doubt thick in the air. We need to think clearly, Daniel said, trying to remain calm. What we saw was terrifying, but it doesn't mean we have to follow the same path. There's still a chance we can all get out, if we stay level-headed. But Ethan, who had been quiet, knew that the situation was spiraling out of control. The moral dilemma they faced, choosing between survival or preserving their humanity, was pushing them all to the edge. He knew that a terrible decision was coming, whether they liked it or not. And what if Ethan started hesitantly? What if there's another way out? Something we haven't thought of? A way that doesn't involve playing their game? Everyone looked at him, desperate for any shred of hope. But the tension between them was undeniable, and each person knew they were being pushed to their limit. Before they could continue, a new sound filled the air. This time, it wasn't the siren, but the unmistakable noise of helicopters in the distance. The sound of rotors spinning grew louder, and the group's eyes widened in surprise. "What is that?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky. "Helicopters!" Olivia exclaimed. "They're coming!" The group stared at the sky, searching for the source of the sound. Through the gaps in the trees, they could see the silhouette of a helicopter approaching, the noise of the blades growing louder as it neared the island. A flicker of hope, long lost, began to grow in their hearts. "Are they here to rescue us?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide with the possibility of salvation. But Daniel, ever cautious, wasn't so quick to believe it. "Don't get ahead of yourselves," he said, his voice laced with doubt. This could be part of the game, another trick. Still, the mere idea of rescue gave the group a surge of energy. They began running toward the sound of the helicopter, their legs driven by the possibility that this nightmare was finally coming to an end. As they reached a clearing, the helicopter began to descend, its blades still spinning as the side door opened. A figure in black stepped out of the helicopter, slowly approaching them. The figure wore a helmet, obscuring their face, and moved with a deliberate, almost ominous, calm. The group hesitated, unsure of what to expect. "Who are you?" Daniel shouted, his voice filled with suspicion. "Are you here to get us off this island?" The figure stepped closer and finally removed the helmet, revealing a middle-aged man with a stern expression and piercing eyes. He surveyed the group for a moment before speaking. "Congratulations on making it this far," the man said, his voice cold and controlled. "What's going on?" Olivia demanded, taking a few steps forward. "Is this part of the game?" The man smiled slightly, but it was a smile without warmth. He looked at each of them, as though assessing their reactions. "The game is almost over," he finally said. "But there's one final test." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The group, already exhausted and emotionally drained, stood in stunned silence, waiting for what was to come next. "Only one of you can leave this island," the man continued. "That has always been the objective. You've been observed, evaluated, and now it's time to make the final decision." The tension in the group reached its breaking point. Ethan stepped forward, his fists clenched. "We're not playing your game," Ethan said firmly. "No matter what you say, we're not killing each other." The man smiled again, but this time there was something darker behind it. "You don't have to worry," he said, turning back toward the helicopter. "The decision has already been made." Before anyone could react, the man signaled to someone inside the helicopter. At that moment, a message appeared on a device strapped to his uniform. The screen flashed a single sentence: "Congratulations. You've completed the first phase. The real game begins now." The group stood in shock, unable to process what they were seeing. The hope of rescue vanished, replaced by a new and deeper sense of terror. "What?" Sarah muttered, her voice weak. The man climbed back into the helicopter, which began to lift off the ground. As the aircraft ascended, the message continued to flash on the screen of each device they had found: "The real game begins now." The helicopter disappeared into the horizon, leaving the group standing in stunned silence, the weight of the final twist sinking in. There was no escape. No rescue. Only the beginning of a new, even more terrifying chapter of the game. The island, as quiet as ever, awaited them.